speaker will be Terry.
Unaccustomed as I am to using PowerPoint, so you'll have to put up with me. When I was preparing this, I discovered ClipUp belatedly, and I discovered that all human life is there in ClipUp. So if that's an over-enthusiastic, you'll have to indulge me. The reason I'm using the PowerPoint is 2 years ago I was at the, or maybe it was 1 year ago, I was at the EP conference, which is the European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy. It was being held at Crete. In fact, it was 2 years ago. And I approached the front of the room when it came time to give my paper, picked up a piece of chalk, held it up and said, "Appropriate technology," and proceeded to give the talk using just the chalk. And Pascal Pettit came up to me afterwards and said, essentially, a piece of chalk and native command of English, appropriate technology, how are you? So he didn't put it quite that way. But, so I'm using PowerPoint. The title of the paper is Social Structures of Accumulation, the State of the Art. And what I'm going to be talking about is basically 3 broad subject headings. Social structure of accumulation theory since 1994, that is, since the publication of the book that David and Michael and myself edited. Theoretical developments largely over that same time period. And then finally, the emergence of the question of a new SSA and its specific theoretical implications. SSA since 1994. There are a number of different categories of contribution, and I'll be briefly touching on David Gordon's later contributions before his untimely death. The question of sociology, that is the entry of sociologists, mostly American sociologists, into the field of social structure of accumulation. Up through 1994, it was pretty much exclusively economists, or people trained as economists. The expansion of the geographical range of social structure of accumulation studies with the inclusion of new countries. The inclusion of some in-depth studies of more specific institutions and industries. And then finally, there's been a fair amount of discussion again since '94 about the new SSA, but I'll keep that for last. Gordon's latter contributions there are 3 major ones, which I have listed here on the slide. Co-authored work with Sam Bowles and Tom Weisskopf, Power, Profits, and Investment. His putting heterodox macro to the test, which was in a sense a culmination really of a lot of his macro modeling work within the social structure of accumulation framework. And then finally, from the drive system to the capital labor accord, econometric tests for the transition between productivity regimes. The first one concerns the stagnation of investment that took place in the 70s and 80s, something we're all quite familiar with. And the study essentially explained this stagnation as due to the decline in underlying capitalist power and the subsequent monetarist cold bath, as David was fond of saying, as an attempt to restore that capitalist power. The second contribution, putting heterodox macro to the test, compares 4 non-orthodox macro models, post-Keynesian, Kaleckian, Marxian, and what David called social structuralist, He actually referred to it more specifically as the lapsus model. After the dictionary definition of lapse, fall into error. But it combined basically Marxian and Keynesian elements, and he thought it was the closest to the social structure of accumulation outlook on the question. And the social structuralist model performed especially well. Was undoubtedly gratified. In the final contribution, he modeled the drive system and then modeled the capital labor accord, tested them to see how much of labor productivity the two models could explain, and discovered that both models performed well in their respective periods. That is, the drive system performed well within the monopoly capitalist social structure of accumulation. The capital labor accord model performed well in the post-World War II period. In the 1930s, neither model performed well. That is, a gap opened up in the ability of the macro models to explain productivity, and Gordon identified this as evidence for a substantial and fundamental transition in the institutional determinants of productivity specifically and labor relations more broadly. He summed up by saying, quote, "The transition between these two productivity systems, as far as such quantitative narratives can take us, appears to provide a resonant illustration of the historical process of institutional restructuring. With all due respect for Alfred Marshall, history does indeed take leaps." Enter sociology. There are basically two broad areas under which much of the sociological work has been done. The first is the spatialization school, and the second area is criminology. The spatialization authors are specifically concerned with labor control. The criminology studies are concerned with social control. So in a sense, it's not accidental that these two areas should emerge as areas of concern within social structures of accumulation. Spatialization first, they identify themselves as a school. Grant, Wallace, and Brady, the main authors, and we can supply you with those references if anybody's interested. The argument is essentially based on the argument in segmented work, divided workers. In segmented work, if you remember, the initial chapter or chapters opens with an explanation of the labor control systems which characterize the three social structures of accumulation in the capitalist era of American economic history. The first social structure of accumulation, the competitive social structure, being characterized by initial proletarianization. The second social structure, the late 1890s, the monopoly social structure, being characterized by homogenization in labor relations, that is, workers increasingly coming to resemble one another, the old craft distinctions and skill distinctions breaking down. Finally, segmentation in the post-World War II period. The spatialization school authors argue if we're in a new SSA, we should be looking at a new method of labor control, or at least potentially we could be. And they argue strongly that, in a sense, parallel with proletarianization, homogenization, segmentation, that the proper name for the emerging strategy of labor control is spatialization. That is the control of workers through the threat of relocation of their jobs, or the actual relocation of their jobs. It's this ability of capital to credibly threaten to move the work, which to a great extent explains the increasing power of capital relative to labor. This argument links the mobility of capital, links, in a sense, globalization to questions of labor control in a restructured capitalism. The increased fragmentation of task and the highly integrated division of labor across different locations allows or creates the possibility of spatialization as a new form of labor control. In a sense, the labor process is being reorganized partly by changing the labor. That is, you can find new pools of labor in new locations. This depends on differences in spatial locations. That is, if the institutional structure of, and they're arguing here specifically about the United States, but I think the argument can be extended globally. If you had a homogeneous institutional structure, there would be no credibility in the threat to leave. That is, you would be going somewhere else where capital would face much the same situation and same problems as it faced in the place it moved from. In order for the threat to move to be credible, you have to have appreciable differences in the capitalist social structure of one place as opposed to another. Consequently, spatialization depends on differences and will have differential impacts on different locations and could indeed reinforce differences. This argument increases the salience of local conditions, and interestingly, I think, for the question of social structures of accumulation at different spatial levels, the overall SSA demands local variation rather than homogenization between areas. So that the overall social structure of accumulation means that local social structures of accumulation must be different one from another. Criminology. Three main articles there: Grant and Martinez, Carlson and Mikulowski, Barlow, and Chiricos. Grant and Martinez look at the relationship of labor relations and crime rates, arguing that conflictual labor relations or more capital labor accord type arrangements in fact have an impact on crime rates, which is appreciable and measurable. Carlson and Mikulowski look at the relationship between unemployment and crime across social structures of accumulation, arguing that it's different in the three different social structures of accumulation. Also arguing that it's different across phases of a single SSA, and I'll come back to that. Barlow, and Chiricos look at institutions of social control and social structures of accumulation. There isn't time to go into any of that in detail. A lot of work done in social structures of accumulation outside the United States. I've already learned that there's a couple of others that I need to add to that since this afternoon. But it's not a bad list, actually, for an outlook or theoretical framework, one of whose main criticisms was that it was too focused on the American case specifically. There's been a fair amount of work to extend it to other places. And interestingly, most of these places are not the metropolitan economies. They're the periphery, the third world, the developing world, whatever label you want to put on. There's also been some work in specific institutions. a major work on changes in corporate structure over the three social structures of accumulation, and then bringing it down to the present economic reorganization by Harland Perkel, Big Business and the State, and work on specific industries. There's a textbook by Grunefeld and Eve on construction economics. They're both British. And the first chapter is on social structures of accumulation, and the second chapter is social structures of housing provision. Interesting argument. Bringing, in a sense, the social structure of accumulation framework down into the analysis of specific industries. A PhD by Daniel Soros under the direction of Marty Wilson looked at the iron and steel industry in the progressive era. Very interesting PhD. I should say this isn't completely comprehensive. I wasn't able to actually get everything. But I'm close. But if I've left you out, it's because of the library. Because I didn't know about you. I thought you should be left out. Theoretical developments. I'm going to have to start moving faster. Discussions essentially around back to basics. The internal coherence of the social structure of accumulation, the application of the social structure of accumulation framework on different temporal scales and different spatial scales. Back to basics, I'm going to blame Mike Wright. If he, well, he'll have plenty of time to deny this if he wants to. The 1997 article, Social Structure of Accumulation Theory, Retrospect and Prospect, arguing that the initial theoretical perspective was informed primarily by Marxian insights concerning class conflict over production and distribution, both at the workplace and in the political arena, and by Marxian and Keynesian macroeconomic analyses, essentially contending that that's the heart of the analysis. And then finally, critiquing some of the overemphasis on the econometric techniques. I'd read that if I had more time. The origins of the Back to Basics movement, I guess, within social structure accumulation theory, unfortunately, part of it, I think, is due to David Gordon's death. Gordon was, at the end, the person who was primarily interested in macro modeling. I think my impression is Bowles and Weisskopf had already moved on to some extent to other interests. And I think David's death also distanced Bowles and Weisskopf from the framework and future work in the framework. Sam Bowles being the person who was most interested, I think, in the less orthodox, heterodox theoretical elements in introducing them to the argument. The participation of sociology, sociology less obsessed with micro-foundations, less openly reactionary as discipline than economics, though the sociologists here will probably argue with me about that, and pressures to disguise the Marxian character of the framework have consequently lessened. Lastly, I think that a more explicit Marxian pedigree has been established for the framework. This is an argument I myself have made, again, running out of time, briefly, that the analysis of finance capital and imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism, made by Hilferding and then refined a bit by Bukharin and Lenin, inspired Sweezy in his treatment of monopoly capital. That Lenin's argument essentially comes into the American monopoly capital school through Sweezy. This is applied directly to questions of shop floor relations by Braverman, and Sweezy and Braverman influence influence than Gordon, Edwards, and Moran. On the question of long swings and stages of capitalism, obviously there's quite a bit else that went into segmented work, divided workers, but I think this is in fact the main influence around the question of stages of capitalism, despite the fact that David Gordon actually denied this in print. The Marxian argument, why has there been a sort of small amount of theoretical elaboration, and I think this is due to its flexibility. I took Barbara's picture up mostly to embarrass her. Great range of mechanisms relate accumulation to its institutional matrix. No general hypothesis is advanced about the relative importance of the different elements of the structural matrix, and there is no privileged list of crucial institutions or forces. But not to leave Barbara alone. The theoretical discussion, I think, has been carried forward in Victor Lippitt's book, Capitalism. I think there are two contributions here I'd like to highlight. One is an explicit definition of institutions, which a lot of us don't do. We spent a lot of time talking about institutions, about defining them. Victor took the really small amount of time necessary to actually do it. And the definition, you'll notice, is quite similar to the American institutionalist school, their definition of of institutions. And I think it makes explicit some of the institutionalist influence on the framework. Secondly, Victor's argument that each SSA has a unique internal coherence which arises from the mutual overdetermination of the institutions. This is a question, again, of the coherence of the SSA, and Victor argues it has implications for the construction of the SSA, the length of the expansion, and the length of the crisis. The application of the framework on different temporal scales, shorter than the long swing, the spatialization school and Rosalie and Hamilton in relation to Jamaica both use a 15-year period, and the argument in India working is essentially a cross-section in time. The Michalowski and Carlson argue that the phases of the SSA are also important. Using the phases identified in segmented work, exploration, consolidation, and decay, they argue that each of these phases consists of a distinct set of qualitative social relations between labor and the state. So that you can distinguish these things between SSAs, but also within SSAs, and specifically according to phases. And consequently, factors cannot be analyzed linearly across SSA phases because the sociological meaning of these variables may differ according to the qualitative character of each SSA phase. I think this is an interesting idea and should be fruitful for further investigation. The application on smaller spatial scales, U.S. states, and even U.S. counties, an article by Lobato, Ruby, and Brown. The question of a new SSA, this is my last time. Like I said, all human life is in clip art, and it's really appropriate that there's something going on there. Anticipating the theoretical analysis. A list there of big institutional transformations since 1973, which I think make a prima facie case for the existence of a new social structure of accumulation. But there are a number of theoretical questions which are raised by this hypothesis of an existing new SSA. First, is this SSA national or global? I have historically argued that SSAs are a national concept because of the integral role of politics and ideology. Victor's argued the same. The new SSA, however, is most frequently referred to as global neoliberalism. I think these two things can be squared, or this circle can be squared, by seeing the post-World War II period as a period of national SSAs, and the current transition is one away from national SSAs. But that's certainly controversial. If global, what is the relation between structures on different spatial scales? That is the global SSA a collection of national SSAs sharing a common international social structure of accumulation, which we argued the post-World War II social structure of accumulation consisted of, or are local SSAs now nested in an overarching overall SSA, similar to the spatialization argument about localities within the United States. If global, what are the implications for class relations? Here I just want to highlight William Robinson's argument about the emergence of the transnational capitalist class, an argument he makes explicitly within a social structure of accumulation context, referencing Barton, Edwards, and Reich in the 1974 or 1994 book. Can growth be sluggish in a social structure of accumulation? Both David and Marty will address this. This is also discussed in Zaros's PhD. What are the implications of that? Phil O'Hara has argued that there is no such thing as a current SSA because it's too unstable, and its instability arises from insufficient aggregate demand and financial and monetary fragility. Does that guy look a little bit like Hyman Minsky? I would argue that it's possible to have crisis tendencies imminent within the SSA from the beginning. It doesn't have to be that stable. This list here I've stolen from the work of Min-Chi Lee. Min-Chi's work within SSAs has been largely around the question of what are the potential contradictions which could end the current SSA. Insufficient aggregate demand, financial and monetary fragility, and then peak oil or environmental crisis. Sorry for going over. Thank you for your